Teachers unions are telling Jewish educators, sorry, you're on your own. And is that a bad thing? Yeah, let's talk about that.
Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show.
Well, hey there, folks. Brian Nichols here on another fun-filled episode of The Brian Nichols Show. I am, as always, your humble host, joining you from our lovely Cardio Miracle Studios here in sunny Eastern Indiana. The Brian Nichols Show is powered by the best heart health supplement in the world, Cardio Miracle. So you all learn more, go ahead and scan that little QR code over my shoulder or hang around. Later in today's episode, we'll talk about how you can lower your resting heart rate, lower your blood pressure while improving your pump at the gym. Stick around. We'll talk about that later on in today's episode. But first, we're talking about a new article over at Real Clear Education, and it's from our good friend Gary Frankel talking about teachers unions saying to Jewish educators, you are on your own. What's going on there? And is everything as bad as it seems? Is it all doom and gloom? Gary, I need help figuring this out. Gary Frankel, welcome back to the Brian Nichols Show. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on the show, buddy. You were on the show back, like 6 weeks or so. You're back on the show. Today, we're talking about your brand new article over at Real Clear World, which is talking about, hey, teachers unions right now are saying, Jewish educators, sorry, you're on your own. And Jews are saying, uh-oh, what do we do now? So, Gary, before we dig into today's conversation about these teacher unions, do us a favor, just reintroduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll dig into the meat and potatoes of today's topic at hand.
Absolutely. I'm a researcher in education policy at Texas A&M University, where I specialize mostly in education reform, the politics of education, and some fun historical stuff. On top of that, I've been a Young Voices contributor for several years, where I've written about major policy and cultural issues, mostly in Texas, but around the country as well. So, this is an issue that kind of branches both of those areas and subjects, and it was something I felt like I needed to say.
Yeah, well, and let's jump right into it, right? Because your article over at Real Clear Education there, the teachers unions, the Jewish educators, you're on your own. Give us the argument here, Gary. What are you seeing right now in the education space as it comes down to what the teachers unions are saying, what they're not saying, and what Jewish educators are experiencing?
Oh, absolutely. Even before the October 7th, 2023 attacks in Israel, anti-Semitic incidents were one of the most common forms of hate crime, especially when it comes to religiously motivated hate crime. And after the October 7th attacks, those rates of anti-Semitic incidents, both in and outside of schools, became exponentially worse. You start seeing those reports in very large numbers, and these aren't just anecdotes. The collective data really backs this up too, of teachers having Heil Hitler saluted to them in the classroom, or being called slurs, or being harassed, sometimes by individual students, sometimes by groups of students, simply because they're Jewish. And what this all serves to do is create a workplace that is innately hostile to Jewish educators. And if students are more focused on harassing their teacher for being Jewish than they are on learning phonics, then down the line, you might start to see some educational impacts as well. Because what the very common argument for public education is that it encourages students to socialize properly, to learn how to interact in society. And if they're being allowed to call Jewish teachers slurs or throw things at them or physically or emotionally harass them without any kind of consequences, well, what are they learning? And what are the unions, the people who are supposed to be protecting these teachers, doing in order to help combat this? And the answer is nothing.
Let's go back to the first piece. So all these kids who are doing horrible things, right? And I think just to set the stage here, nobody is arguing that it's good for a 14-year-old to go to Mrs. Steinberg and say Heil Hitler. Like, no, that's bad. No bueno. But let me ask you this, Gary, because I'm old. We were just talking about this beforehand. I'm an old man, but I'm not too old. I grew up in the 90s. I grew up in the millennia, or the turn of the millennia, rather, turn of the century into the millennia. I can get this right. But I never saw this in school. We never saw kids, openly touting anti-Semitism. We never saw this kind of intense, I guess, I don't want to use the word attack. I think that might be a little too aggressive, but at the very least, this prodding of Jewish educators or just Jews in general. So this kind of makes my spidey senses tingle a little bit, Gary. Something has shifted in the ether, and let's just call it out for what it is. I'm going to go back to 3 episodes ago with our good buddy Abdullah Hayek. We were on the show and we were talking about how there has been a massive shift, not just away from support of Israel from young Americans, but even you look at the GOP, for example, young Americans, we went from 63% of young GOP voters supporting Israel back in 2021 down to 48% just 3 years later. And a lot of that, Gary, I'm just going to call it out, right? A lot of it, there's a couple things, but the main focus has been obviously what's happening over the Gaza Strip. Lots of young people seeing what's actually happening over there via the lenses of social media like TikTok or Twitter. And we could talk about the credibility of those videos as we go through today's episode. But you see that. And then also, I'm just going to call it out, right? And this is not anti-Semitic. This is not anti-Jew. This is not conspiracy theory. This is just, I think, what people are starting to acknowledge is that there is very much a large Israel, not Jew, Israel, and I'm not going to use the word control, but an influence on American political discourse and policy. And we're seeing that right now, not just in what's happening with America and our influence over the Middle East and bombing Iran, but also the enablement and support financially, but also with weapons of Israel and their occupation of Gaza. We're seeing right now, all the question marks around the Jeffrey Epstein thing, which has been rearing its ugly head. And oh, by the way, the Trump administration coming out of left field and saying, if you are, I think it was a state that was a state or a business, that's right, who was not in favor of the Israeli government, that you were going to have potential aid get withheld from you from FEMA. Now, this all got pulled back because there was such a outcry from the public. But I say all that, Gary, because when you put all these pieces together, I definitely see a different narrative as it pertains to the Israeli government side of things, right? Relative to what it was back when we were growing up in the 90s and 2000s. And a lot of it, I'm going to just call out and say a lot of it is self-inflicted wounds. That's at least my perspective. Gary, what do you think? Am I off base? Am I on base? But, maybe a little off base. Hit me with it.
Well, we can quibble about the particularities and all that until the cows go home. But you're right in that there definitely has been a cultural shift away from supporting the Israeli government, and whether you support Israel or not.
And by the way, just want to call that out. It's the Israeli government, not the Jewish people. There is a fundamentally different thing. I can be supportive of America, the country, without being supportive of the American government, which by the way, many of the episodes we've had here on the show, we've been very adamantly against the American government. So it doesn't make me anti-American. It makes me anti-goofball policies. So I just want to outline that for all the folks being like, Brian's an anti-Semite. No, we're just trying to have a conversation, folks. So continue.
Yeah, but like I said, whether you support the Israeli government or not, and you can quibble about the particularities there all you want, it's a factual statement that the narrative has shifted. But I think there have been a couple of things that have really transferred that narrative from being specifically about the Israeli government to being just your everyday Jewish teacher who lives in Massachusetts. And one of those is because of social media, and the other is educational. The social media problem is that culturally over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a big upswing in the interest of conspiracy theories. You see conspiracy podcasts, conspiracy shows, conspiracy documentaries. It becomes a hobby to be really into conspiracy theories. And if you go down that rabbit hole far enough, you eventually get to the oldest conspiracy theory of all, and in some ways the juiciest or most appetizing conspiracy theory, which is that, Jews control the weather, they run the world, and all these.
The juiciest is that? Did you do that on purpose?
No, but I should have.
The juiciest of the conspiracy theories. That's right.
It's
okay,
a very
continue.
old conspiracy theory. It's never gone away. It's gotten wrapped up in a lot of the Masonic conspiracy theories as well. And when you take the popularity of that type of conspiratorial mindset, along with the cultural shift against Israel, what you get is a lot more anti-Semitism in the United States. And the problem with that from an educational perspective is that both administrators and unions are unwilling to protect their teachers for different reasons. In the case of the administrators, it's mostly because they're afraid of getting sued. And, if they do anything to really support student discipline, then, oh no, the angry parents will make our lives difficult. So we're just going to ignore anything that happens to our teachers. But from the union perspective, it's mostly because they no longer function as an ordinary union. Unions have always been, at least for the last 130 years, a really big part of the Democratic Party. But there's been a shift in the last 20, 30 years or so where the teachers unions used to do union things like civil liability protections or advocating for teachers' rights or fighting for pay increases or fighting with the administrators or whatnot. But really now they're they're essentially a PAC for the Democratic Party. That's how they operate for the most part. They're an extremely decentralized super PAC whose main reason for existence is to raise money and then give it to Democrats. And when you look at how the unions are acting from that mindset, they're acting much more like a Democratic activist group than they are a traditional labor union. And because the Democratic activist group aren't really interested in protecting Jewish educators right now, left-wing anti-Semitism has become a really big problem, then the unions aren't going to do that either, since they're essentially just a progressive arm of the Democratic Party.
So when's the last time you really thought about your heart health? No, not after just a bad checkup or after seeing a loved one go through something scary, but really thought about it. And the reality is most people don't until it's too late. We chalk it up to fatigue, brain fog, or just high blood pressure, or hey, maybe we're just getting older, or it's that dreaded stress. But the root cause might be something deeper. Your body's production of nitric oxide dropping off. That one molecule plays a critical role in keeping your arteries open, your blood pressure normal, and your cells oxygenated. And without enough of it, you're not performing at the best mentally or physically. And that's why I've been taking Cardio Miracle for 2 years now. It's a nitric oxide powerhouse packed with over 50 ingredients like organic beetroot, L-arginine, CoQ10, vitamin D3 that are all clinically proven to help support circulation, reduce inflammation, and supercharge your energy levels. It's not just heart support, it's whole body support. So if you're tired of feeling off, give your heart and your health the boost it needs. Just click the link in the show notes or scan that little QR code over my shoulder, or head to cardiomiracle.com/TBNS to start your journey today. Discount already applied. Just look for the note, "You're shopping with Brian Nichols" at checkout. One more time, that's cardiomiracle.com/TBNS. And now, let's get back to the show. I'm pulling up. Here we go. This is so I forget the guest's name. I had a guest on my show probably 5-6 months ago. And she was promoting like a much more public education system, and she's from Canada. And she was, I'm not trying to pick again, but she was not prepared for the conversation that she was about to have with me, because I was like, well, let's talk about unions, right? And we dug into the unions, and her eyes were actually kind of open, because I actually shared this slide here. Well, it wasn't this slide in particular, but I mean, you just go through the different donations. I mean, look at this, right? The National Education Association, they had $32 million to Democrats, specifically over $3 million to liberal groups, over $29 million. How much money went to Republicans? $51,000. And by the way, this is just a reoccurring theme. National Federation of Teachers, $7 million totally raised. How much went to Republicans and conservative groups, Gary? 0. How much for the American Federation of Teachers Solidarity? They raised $3 million. How many went to Republicans and conservative groups? 0. Oh, here we go. New York State United Teachers Association. They raised $2 million. Only 39,000 went to Democrats. Oh wait, there we go. 2 million went to the liberal groups. How many went to Republicans? $559. So, like, to your point, right? These teacher unions have become far less teacher unions and instead
political activist arms of the Democratic Party. And by the way, this does kind of correlate to what you're outlining in your article, is that as these unions have gotten less about teachers and more about political narratives and policy positions that they're trying to promote, they've become infinitely more left leaning. And by the way, that correlates and tracks exactly with where the voting base of these Democratic establishments are heading. And that's much more towards, to your point, not just aware and frustrated with the war over in the Gaza Strip between Israel and the Palestinians, but it goes more into the world of anti-Semitism, which I think we all do see. But I say all that, isn't this more of an argument, Gary, against teacher unions just in general than it is an anti-Semitic type of argument? I mean, help me out here.
It's absolutely an argument against teachers unions in general. And it's not something that's new. This sort of trend has been seen before. My great-grandfather started a trade association in Brooklyn because the union for the garment district wouldn't protect Jewish workers, and it was just funneling money to whatever political candidates they want. So this is a very old problem. It's not new, but it goes to show that once your labor union becomes politically powerful enough, then it's going to act more like a political organization than a union, and it's going to forget the reason why it exists in the first place, which is to protect its members.
Yeah, well, and let's kind of like go back to your article here, though. You mentioned the ADL, right? The ADL is not doing much, the Anti-Defamation League. But I've also seen them play more of a partisan type of narrative here as well. And again, all of the things that we're supposed to be supporting in this case, it's actually supporting against anti-Semitism. Now it's in essence just abdicating the conversation. But at the same point in time, the ADL has been absolutely an attack arm going after people who aren't anti-Semitic, but just questioning the Israeli government. And I guess this is where your younger voters, you mentioned, social media, for example, and conspiracy theories earlier. How much of this turns into just real life, though, man? Like this is the stuff that kids are living through right now, and they're kind of seeing it happen in real time. I mean, it's. I'm not saying you're doing this, but it's very easy to say, well, these darn kids, they're getting brain rot from social media. They're just learning things that aren't true. But I mean, I'm seeing a lot of this stuff becoming more of a topic in more right-wing circles of people saying, hey, hold up. Like, why are we spending billions of dollars over to Israel every single year? And that's not anti-Semitic to say, I don't think this is a good idea, right? Like, where is the fine line between conspiracy theory and social media bubbles versus what we're actually seeing happen in real life?
Well, what I will say is that brain rot cuts across the political spectrum. It's not a left-wing problem. It's a right-wing. It
starts with cocoa melon. Yeah.
Everyone has brain rot. But the big problem that people who support Israel have really run into, and some of these issues have eventually drifted down towards American Jewish educators who have nothing to do with Israel, is that organizations like the ADL have really shot themselves in the foot.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, the ADL has acted as a progressive political arm that just so happens to be pro-Israel for 15, 20 years. And after a while, it got to the point where it wasn't really an Israel advocacy organization anymore. It was just a progressive political arm. So it made a lot of enemies that way that it didn't really need to make. But
why? Let's talk about that. Why? Why did it get so left-wing?
Because everything got so left-wing. The leadership was very involved in the Democratic establishment at the time. Support for Israel was pretty widespread. There hadn't really been, at the point where they really made the shift, there hadn't been a huge war involving Israel in the Middle East for like 15, 20 years at that point. So it was a time in which there was essentially nothing to do. So they shifted more towards domestic progressive political causes.
But what was it though? Like, and this is the part I'm stuck on. Like, why the shift towards the leftist political causes?
It's because it's what they believed in. It's what the leadership believed in, and there wasn't enough with the main mission to really distract from that. It was mission creep.
But doesn't that? And I'm not picking, but like and this is again, I'm a pastor's kid, right? So I grew up more on the Christian side of the house, but like, at least my understanding is that a Jewish culture is, I mean, I'm not a big Ben Shapiro fan, but like when you listen to his nasally little voice, I hear nothing but conservative social approaches to Judaism versus what we're seeing, to your point, from the ADL. So why is there such a discrepancy between like true adherence to like Jewish scripture and values, and then the organization that was built literally to help promote the support and defense of that culture, now almost embracing the very things it was supposed to be against? I'm having trouble squaring that through the round peg through the square hole.
Yeah, well, I was raised Catholic, but my dad's family is Jewish, so I can sort of see it from both perspectives, kind of. But the thing about Judaism in the United States is that in the U.S., and this is a drastic oversimplification, but for the purpose of a 45-minute conversation, there are three primary religiosity levels. You have the lowest, which are Reform Jews, who maintain a lot of the cultural traditions of the old Jewish communities, especially when they first came to the United States. They, participate in some of the religious rituals. Some of them believe in God, but for the most part, it's become more of a cultural tradition than a religious one. So if you ever hear a person say, I'm religiously atheist, but culturally Jewish, they likely come from one of these Reform communities. And it's the Reform community that's really been involved in progressive democratic politics for a really long time and are generally much more secular in their viewpoints and their outlooks. The smallest of the three groups is in the middle. Those are conservative Jews who are more pious, but also completely modernized. And they're pretty politically split. Although a lot of them are increasingly tending towards the GOP. And then you have Orthodox Jews who, are the stereotypical, extremely socially conservative, practicing Jew.
The Lakewood, New Jersey Jews.
Well, it depends on where in New Jersey.
No, I said Lakewood. The Lakewood, New Jersey Jews. Yeah,
like Lakewood or Crown Heights in Brooklyn or the southern part of Williamsburg. It's so they're generally much more socially conservative. And politically, they're very complicated. It's generally based on whoever will leave them alone the most, which at least historically has often been Democrats.
The libertarian Jews.
Well, libertarians in terms of external. Internally, they're very conservative.
Yeah.
So the ADL is firmly squared within the Reform Jewish political, social, and theological movement, and it's been attached to the Democratic Party for a really long time. So they had essentially all the incentive in the world to move in that direction when they had nothing better to do. But the problem with the ADL is that all of their political advocacy that made many unnecessary enemies aside, is that they have been the best provider of really substantive Holocaust education for like 50 or 60 years. And everybody is going to squander that because they're mad at the ADL or because they're mad at Israel. So a lot of the things that really acted as a bulwark against anti-Semitism, and not just anti-Semitism, but frankly, human evil, because I think the Holocaust is one of the best ways to educate students about evil. And now we're going to lose that, which is a real shame, and which is something that I was trying to get at in the article.
Well, and really quick, because I want to go back to this, right? First, the ADL piece, and then I want to dig into more of the cultural side of things, right? So when we look at the ADL, you mentioned how they're a great use case to help explain, the history of the Holocaust, and to your point, how to showcase the horrors of what happened during the Holocaust. But this is where I hear a lot of young folks in general, right? They say, I've literally been browbeaten with the Holocaust since the time that, pretty much we agreed that kids are able to deal with learning about atrocities like this. I think like 6th grade in America is usually around the time, 5th, 6th grade, where you start to dip your toe into that world. And like 7th, 8th grade, you really like, you'll do the Holocaust courses and stuff. And then as you go to high school, that's when you usually do like go to the National Holocaust Museum or whatever it may be. But I also hear a lot of these young folks say, why am I learning only about this and not the other atrocities that we've heard happen over the years? Like, we've heard of the atrocities of the Holodomor. We've heard of the atrocities, in all the African countries where literal genocides were happening and millions of people were killed. We don't hear about the atrocities that happened back between China and Japan, right? Like, there are other areas in history where we've had horrific types of human suffering at the behests of large governments that I think are also great use cases to learn from. And what happens is students are starting, because they have access to all this information, they can start to learn about this stuff on their own. And it's not that they are questioning the Holocaust, but they're questioning, why is it that we're only learning about the Holocaust? Why are we not learning about all these other horrible things that have happened? And why is it always through the confines of everybody's favorite boogeyman, World War II, to leverage anytime there's anything bad happening foreign policy wise? I just had this conversation in our last episode where, we were talking about how, the Palestinians, the Hamas, they're the modern, they're Hitler incarnate, right? They're the Nazis incarnate, or Saddam Hussein was Hitler incarnate, or Muammar al-Gaddafi is Hitler incarnate, or Vladimir Putin is Hitler incarnate. Like, we see this reoccurring theme time and again. So that's part one. I would say, modern day people aren't necessarily looking at the Holocaust as the only avenue to articulate human suffering at a grand scale. But then number two, going back to what you're talking about, the ADL specifically, is while they were promoting this, they were also at the same point in time promoting more left-wing progressive cultural side of things, right? So it almost turns into this whole H.L. Mencken, ism, if you will, of, well, sorry, you're going to get what you want good and hard. And that is, if you continue to promote this left-wing progressive stance, you're going to get you're either going to have that organization turn on you because it's the opposite of you, or you're going to push so far hard both to the left, but also in a narrative standpoint, you're going to isolate and alienate a lot of folks. Maybe they don't really, like, I'm not saying they're not passionate, but like, this isn't one of their top 5 issues, but you're just going to push them so much because you're browbeating them to the death to say, you know what? I wasn't aware. I didn't really pay attention. And now I'm pushed so far that I'm actually going to go more towards being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel or anti-Israel, like all these other things, right? So that's the other part I'm concerned about, is that because the push so hard from the ADL culturally left and the incessant focus on only Jewish areas, right? It turns the younger voters who now have access to all this information saying, well, why aren't they focusing on these other areas? Why are we only focusing on the Jewish problems and stuff? And that turns into what we're seeing today. And you rightly outline in your article, young kids feeling enabled to say horrible things to teachers simply because they're Jewish.
Well, yeah. And, to some of your earlier points, I'm always in favor of people learning more history than less history, regardless of where the history comes from. But in the education system, you deal with scarcity in multiple areas. You have only limited time. You have only limited resources. And, education definitely has a values construction sort of role in society, regardless of what kind of school you're sending your kids to. So there are certain principles that you want your kids to learn. And I think the reason why Holocaust education has been particularly emphasized, and I do think that Holocaust education advocates have done a pretty poor job of explaining this over the decades, probably because for so long after World War II, it was just known, and now it's not. And so they have no practice in really explaining.
You think that's the case?
Yes.
That people don't know the Holocaust?
I think there's 2 reasons why Holocaust education in particular serves as a really good example to highlight human evil, because you get unique forms of evil in multiple ways. And the first reason is I think the Holocaust was more systematic and recorded than pretty much any other genocide in human history. Because even when you see really brutal genocides like Rwanda, for example, it wasn't systematic in quite the same way. It wasn't as if you had boxcars of people being sent to death camps. It was a lot of widespread wanton violence. It was random in many cases. It wasn't systematically evil in both scope and scale in the same way that the Holocaust was, just in terms of how rigid the Nazis were in their record keeping. That's a unique aspect to the Holocaust that you don't really see in other genocides. It was the record keeping aspect of it. You don't even see that with Pol Pot, who proportionately killed a similar number of people in his own country. And I think the other aspect of the Holocaust that makes it unique from a historical perspective is kind of the what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, in which everybody insisted that they were just doing what they were told. They were just doing their jobs. They didn't really think about it actively. And meanwhile, 11 million people, 6 million of which were Jews, were being sent to death camps to just be exterminated in a mass fashion. When you look at human history, even in instances where, in really horrible instances in which a whole lot of people died, you don't really see the same sort of bureaucracy. You don't really see the same scale of that bureaucracy. You don't see the meticulous record-keeping element. You don't see the collective shrug of somebody saying, well, I was just doing my job, which I think is what makes the Holocaust uniquely useful from an educational perspective, in order to teach kids to have good values, to be able to recognize evil when they see it. Heck, to recognize that bureaucracy isn't always a good thing. But, advocates for this sort of educational approach have done a really poor job of explaining why that's important, because I think from the 50s to the 80s, maybe even the 90s, everybody just kind of knew why it was important. But we're far enough removed from World War II now that that's no longer necessarily the case. And I think the other point there is that, there definitely is a bit of a pipeline from where somebody gets interested in looking at the situation in Gaza, and then they go deeper, and eventually they just spiral to the point where American Jews are the targets of their ire, just because from whatever they've read and from whatever they've read, they start to associate American Jews with Israel. And even though American Jews are more likely to be supportive of Israel than some other groups, the dual loyalties thing is anti-Semitic. The random guy who owns a bagel store in New York isn't like some Mossad operative. The Jewish educators are Americans just like everyone else, and deserve the same sort of protections, regardless of whatever is happening with the war in Gaza at that particular moment.
If you're a small business owner and your phone contract is coming up for renewal, ask your provider if you can just go month to month. Watch what happens. They'll stammer, they'll delay, or straight up dodge the question. Why? Because they don't want to earn your business. They want to lock it up. And that's why I'm such a fan of Level 365. They don't play the contract game. Everything's month to month. No tricks, no traps. If they're not delivering, you can walk. But here's the kicker. You won't want to. Phones that actually serve you, not hold you hostage. That's Level 365. So this going back to what you said earlier about how certain schools or education systems have values they promote, right? And again, this is the argument. This is not Brian's perspective. I'm trying to play devil's advocate here, right? This is where I think a lot of young folk are starting to get more and more asking questions, right? Because they hear what you're saying and they're like, yeah. And that's all I see is this narrative. I see this narrative in the education system. I see this narrative on the corporate news. I see this narrative coming from Hollywood. I see this, and it's constant, right? I think I used this last time I was talking about like everybody's perspective of World War II is through the confines of Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers and Schindler's List, and like that's how we view history. But when you when you take a step back, what folks are more and more starting to point at is saying, why is it only presented through this perspective? Why is it only being said through the context of how bad things have been for Jews. And it's, again, this is not to say that things haven't been, and it's not to say that the history is fake. That's not the point at all. The question, though, back to your original point when we started this tangent here, is things have values that are being promoted, right? And there's a focus on these values. Why is it, and this is the question that young folks are asking, why is it that this is the only lens that we are taught and shown the world through? And by the way, the more reason I think people are asking this question goes back to the first part we talked about, because now they have access to all the information. So you may have not heard of the Holodomor unless you were focusing specifically on Eastern Europe issues, right? You went to that college class, you went to the library and stumbled across that book. Now you're scrolling through your newsfeed and you might see something about the Holodomor and you're like, oh, what's this, right? And all of a sudden, more and more young folk are getting educated, be it fully educated or bits and pieces here and there, right? Which that's another huge part. But like, they're starting to see things that traditionally were not discussed. So then what happens is, Gary, they go to, Mrs. Steinberg, right? And they say, well, Mrs. Steinberg, tell me about the Holodomor. And she's like, well, I don't really know much about the Holodomor. And they're like, oh, yeah, it's because you're Jewish. That's why, Mrs. Steinberg, right? You don't want to talk about this because this ruins your narrative. And it turns into Cartman from South Park. Hey, you guys, what are you doing? Right? Like that's where this turns into. And that's, I think, the kind of I won't say it's a diagnosis, but it's certainly, I think, one of the levers that has been pulled recently is that the younger folk I'm not saying they're more educated, but they are more aware. They have access to way more information, be it good or bad, that their brothers and sisters that were a little bit older than them, or their parents, their aunts, and their uncles, they never had access to this much stuff. So when they go to ask these questions of folks, they get deer in the headlight looks. And that creates the perception of conspiracy, right? Back to your very first point, that a lot of this stuff turns into conspiracy theory stuff. But the conspiracy theory isn't so much the conspiracy theory as it is when they're trying to uncover more information and they're getting that deer in the headlights look, or they just are told, like, no, we don't really talk about that.
Yeah, well, one of the downsides of the democratization of knowledge is that stupid people get a vote in the construction of that knowledge. It's very decentralized and democratized. But to your main point, I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying about advocates for Holocaust education doing a poor job of explaining why it is important. Because the answer that a lot of students get, either from their teachers or from the internet or from the ADL itself in some cases, is that, well, it's because, Jews are important and it was a unique form of oppression, which is all true, but it's not really a satisfying answer for people who...
And by the way, like, I'm just going to use an example. Like, I grew up in upstate New York, and there's tons of, like, call them Orthodox Amish, right? Like almost Shiite Amish. They are 1000% into the Amish culture. And I'll never forget, like, I was walking through Walmart, and this is back when, remember Guitar Hero, Gary? Remember Guitar Hero back in the day, right? And for y'all young kids, back in the day, they used to have like those things set up in the store. So you'd walk in and you'd see Guitar Hero, and you're like, let me give it a shot. And you just like rock out on aisle 6 for like, 3 minutes as you play a song. And I'll never forget, my buddy Keith and I were walking through Walmart, and we see like these two little Amish kids who had stumbled across this Guitar Hero. And they were playing Guitar Hero, and then like their dad comes out of nowhere and like starts screaming German at them and pulls them away. And I always think about those kids. Like, what if those kids had come home and, a couple of years later, they're just thinking back to the time they were at Walmart playing that Guitar Hero. And they started asking, like, Dad, tell me about the guitar that I was playing Guitar Hero. And he's just like, you do not talk about that, right? Like, if that's the mentality, that's going to foster conspiracy in that kid. Like, why? Why am I not allowed to talk about this, right? So going back to what you were just outlining here, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like, this is kind of where I think the younger folk are, is that it's not that they're conspiracy minded just at the onset. It's because when they do dip their toe into something, and they start to have questions, and they've only been presented things through this lens, Amish, this is how you do things, right? And also they see the Guitar Hero, and they're like, wow, wait, there's Guitar Hero over here. Hold on, let's talk, Dad. Have you ever played Crazy Train on Guitar Hero, right? Like, let's talk about this, Dad. But like they see that and it opens up Pandora's box of questions. And if you're told you're not allowed to ask that question, and actually if you do ask that question, you're anti-Semitic, right? That's where I think people start to get not just skeptical, but that's where the conspiracy mind starts to really manifest. And I know what you said, earlier, like, well, this is because a lot of the Jewish educators and you folks, who are helping promote this stuff have done a poor job. That sounds like that's a them problem. Like it's your job to make sure that you're presenting this in the right way and maybe answering questions as they come out. Have responses ready, not just we don't talk about that. We focus on this.
Yeah, I agree with you. And if you look at the research literature, I think people are starting to recognize this, at least the people who are creating this sort of curriculum and advocating for it. The problem is whenever something starts to pick up steam in academia, it takes several years for it to sort of drip down into
those damn unions, man.
So part of the problem is that even though the research literature is beginning to recognize this problem, it's going to take 10 years before anything practical comes out of it, just because of the slow speed at which academic research moves.
Mm-hmm.
And, I do think that people do need to have legitimate responses ready other than just, you can't talk about that.
Yep.
I do. And because those responses are out there, there are factual or at least logically philosophical reasons for why this form of education is particularly important and why the Holocaust is a particularly good example of some of these phenomenon of evil. But because that's not getting explained, because it's just, you can't talk about this, it opens up an opportunity, not just for the conspiratorial sort of thinking that you mentioned, but also the grifters, for people who realize that
you went literally where my head was.
People an answer.
Well, and listen, I'm just going to call him out, and I'm getting ready for all the groypers to jump into my mentions here. But like Nick Fuentes, this is literally why he exists, right? Yeah. Because he can ask questions and do his Nick Fuentes-isms, and then the ADL says, don't listen to him, he's bad. And all that does is, Peter Griffin in Family Guy, where he's standing there and he sees the big red button that says, do not push. You're going to push the button, right? And that's where kids are right now. They're saying, why are you so against me listening to him? Like, oh, you know what? Now I want to listen to him.
Well, part of the problem is that people haven't realized that sometimes ignoring these type of people entirely is better than just saying they're bad, don't listen to them. Because when you say that they're bad, don't listen to them, you're creating a taboo.
Well, can I challenge that?
Yes.
I agree with you. Like, definitely, like, don't just say don't listen to them, but I don't think ignoring them is the right path either. And here's, I'm going back to my sales guy, like sales executive world, right? Like, when I'm coaching a new company on the go-to-market strategy. So this is, you're a company and you're trying to reframe how you're going to start, doing your sales motion, right? You're trying to figure out what pieces to put in place. And part of that is understanding what your competition's doing and either to address it in a roundabout way or to directly take it on, right? And we see a lot of the best narratives are in taking it on and diffusing it. So, for example, let's just go towards a political example. During the 2024 election, one of the most impactful ads that was run on the Trump campaign was the Trump transgender ad against Harris, where it was Kamala Harris is for they, them. Donald Trump is for you, right? He addressed it. He diffused it. And it became so powerful that I would dare say that won over enough folks that brought a couple states into his back pocket, right? So I hear you. Like, I get it. Like, don't just ignore them, or rather, don't just say don't listen to them. But I also think it's dangerous to say don't engage or don't listen to them. Like, don't talk about them, because they still exist. There's still a market, and if you're not addressing that market will drift towards them, because they're going to see, not even the ignoring piece. They're going to look for whatever tangible value, be it good or not, that they're going to get from that group.
It's a fair argument, definitely a fair argument. But I think I would have two responses for that.
Yeah.
First is the taboo element there is definitely very, very strong. And when you say you can't say that, you can't read that, you can't look at that, you can't think that way, it makes the taboo very, very tempting. Kind of like how, having premarital sex or smoking weed while in high school or going to a party and getting absolutely trashed on alcohol you're not supposed to have used to be a very firm sort of taboo. And it was the taboo aspect of it that made it more interesting, that made it more enticing. And I think people are sort of falling into those holes now on social media with particular forms of ideas. But as for the ignoring piece, I hear you when it comes to sales and when it comes to an open market. Very, very fair. And those types of contexts, I would probably agree with you. But sometimes I feel like the marketplace of ideas isn't as much of a marketplace as people think it is sometimes, because when it comes to ideas, when it comes to philosophies, when it comes to history, even, you have to have a canon. Society, and just to borrow a term from the great books people. And if you don't have a canon, if you don't have, a central array of works and ideas and philosophies that you say, yes, that defines us as a society. Yes, this is who we are. It's kind of difficult to make it work.
But you understand though, that like, if you have that canon, just because that's kind of the accepted norm, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to accept the norm, right? And if that's the case, then if somebody presents a different perspective from the canon and they're able to present it in an effective way, that will inevitably, despite being ignored, lead more people to, even if they're not jumping on board immediately, start to pay attention, start to casually listen. And then fast forward 10, 15 years down the road, all of a sudden that just random thought that came out of the ether as an alternative to the canon now starts to gain traction. All of a sudden now, instead of just being one person, it's 1 million people who are buying into this. And all of a sudden, instead of effectively addressing and doing away with this goofball narrative, now the goofball narrative has legs. And now there are people who are going to support it. That's where I think that this needs to at least be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Sure, have the canon, but don't just ignore. Like, you have to be able to address the arguments people are raising up. Otherwise, it goes back to why aren't they addressing it? Why are they just like ignoring it?
Well, you can't address every single argument. You can't address every single person.
Why not?
And that's part of the problem with the democratization of knowledge, is because there's too many stupid people for you to be able to adequately and meticulously go after every single one.
But Gary, those people vote.
Well, yeah, yes, they do. Sometimes they do.
But for the folks who do vote, right, and they have maybe the goofball opinions, I mean, what are you going to do? And that turns into policy.
Well, and I think, and my friend Aaron Pomerantz, who's a social psychologist,
friend of the show,
yep, he's written some good articles about this where, I do think, not legally, of course, I don't think there should be outright censorship. I'm a big free speech guy, but I do think there's a bit of social responsibility on the part of major platformers to people like Joe Rogan, for instance, to be able to sift through, yes, this is a legitimate challenge to established conventional wisdom. And I think this challenge is credible and worthwhile enough to be heard. And this is gobbledygook, which sounds really pretty, but I'm going to have him on anyway because it'll mean I get clicks.
But hold on really quick, because we go back to the Daryl, what's his name? Not Daryl Cooper. Have you been? What the hell is that guy's name? I
think it is.
No, not him. It was the one that debated Dave Smith.
Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Douglas Murray.
Murray. That's right.
Yeah, Douglas Murray. So like when Douglas Murray debated Dave Smith as that foil, right? He just dismissed. He's like, instead of saying, oh, well, let's address those points that Dave just brought up. He goes through. Have you ever been to Israel, Dave? You haven't. Well, how can you have an opinion on this? You're not an expert. You're a comedian. So he was trying to do the thing of almost ignoring it by like making it goofball, but he didn't address the points Dave raised, and that led to more folks saying, well, hold on, what about the points that Dave raised?
I think it was worse for Murray to do that debate and respond the way he did than it would have been for him to just not do anything at all. Because when I say ignoring, I mean ignoring.
But hold on though. Dave doesn't go away though. Like Dave has one of the top platforms in more of like the new up and coming political right. Like he's not going to just disappear.
And I think the reason why he has such a big platform is because frankly of people like Murray who just dismiss it to his face. If you're going to dismiss somebody, that's not ignoring. That's engaging with him very poorly.
Mm-hmm. But Dave had a platform before Murray engaged.
It wasn't as big.
That's fair.
It wasn't nearly as big. It wasn't nearly as prominent. That kind of shot him up a lot more than it would have been organically.
That's fair, but it doesn't change the fact that Dave still has been able to get lots of folks to pay attention to, especially, the Israeli questions that have been raised up, America's involvement in supporting Israel, not just that, but also, where the Israeli government has pulled certain levers to make certain things happen or not happen in certain instances. Like these are things that Dave has been raising up for, a decade at this point. It's not that, to your point, that it didn't help grow his platform, but I would say that Dave had a platform by which that Douglas Murray felt compelled to respond to, because there's been so many people who are buying into what Dave is selling.
Well, I think that's where the taboo aspect starts to come out again.
Okay.
Because people like Dave Smith over the past 15, 20 years, just because of the way that organizations like the ADL were moving and the way advocates, sort of circling back to Holocaust education, failed to adequately present why this is particularly important, why this is particularly useful, why this is an unusual sort of evil in the manner and the scale to which it was conducted, is that they created a taboo out of asking these questions. Mm-hmm. They created temptation. And people who have an interest of either simply have an interest in making money or truly believe these things, and those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You can have true believers who are also very interested in making money. You artificially create a market for that sort of platform, for that sort of subversion. And I'm using subversion in the technical sense, not in the, he's a subversive sense. You artificially create a market for that. And I think that's why it's become so popular. I think there would have been some undercurrent of it, even without even if everything had gone perfectly. But I don't think it would be nearly as strong. I don't think it would be nearly as powerful. I don't think it would be nearly as prominent as it would be right now, because all those sorts of things happen. And I think the root cause for most of it, just like the cause for a lot of conspiratorial movements throughout American history like this, the Know Nothings being a good example, some of the weird populist movements around the turn of the 20th century, it's complacency. When you have complacency and you just dismiss everything vocally in a very unsubstantive way, you create the taboo. And I think that's what we're dealing with again.
Well, and by the way, Gary, like it also goes back to when I think fair points are raised, and there is not just a refusal to acknowledge or address the point, but rather then turning it to, you're a bad person for even raising the point, that turns more people to be skeptical, right? Because when Dave Smith says, well, hold on, why was Benjamin Netanyahu and his government in Israel, like behind the scenes, acknowledging and admitting that they would prefer to have Hamas in control of the Gaza Strip, because then it gave them a boogeyman to actually compete against and leverage for any potential military occupation, which, by the way, here we are. When those things are raised up, and then you're called an anti-Semite for raising up something that is, I dare say, objectively true, or at least has not been outright denied, right? Like that turns into, well, hold on, Douglas Murray, why can't you address this? Why can't you just, instead of straw manning or trying to respond to a question you wish Dave asked, respond to the actual questions? And this is where more and more folks are saying, well, hold on, you're telling me one narrative and I'll listen to your narrative, but if people ask you questions for specific details or potential questions that might change the narrative, if I'm not even allowed to ask that question, and if I do ask that question, you're not going to answer it, then that goes back to okay, that tells me there's something here. There's a here. Do you see that pipeline?
Oh, absolutely. And I think academia is frankly a pretty big cause of that kind of thing, because a problem that a lot of academics have, and I can say this because I'm in the belly of the beast, is that academics are really fond of ad hominem. They love addressing an argument by addressing the person who made that argument and saying why they're not credible. It's a whole war about credentialism. It's, I have a PhD in this, and therefore I'm allowed to speak on it, but you don't have a PhD in this, or you have a PhD in a slightly different field. That means you're not allowed to talk about this at all because you don't have the proper credentials. And I think there's a big difference between dismissing the person and dismissing the argument. And you can dismiss an argument without dismissing the person by just saying, even in the context of like a quick rapid fire debate, you can just say there's absolutely no evidence to support this, and there's some evidence against this because of primary source A and secondary source B.
But what if Dave does the same thing and says, okay, here's evidence, here's a telegram from Benjamin Netanyahu to his leadership, right? Saying we want Hamas in power because it will help us have, an argument to make military occupation in the future. Like, if Dave presents that, and again, this is not my world. I am a messaging and sales expert. I am not a foreign policy expert, but I've heard enough to be dangerous. But I've heard Dave, make these arguments, and he's not doing it by just making outlandish claims. He's offering actual data that he then presents, and people just ignore the piece he presents, and they instead put the piece of data and evidence into his argument, to your point, and then reject the argument. But the data and the piece of evidence still exist. So in the rejection of the argument, you're also rejecting the data and evidence, which that's where people are like, well, hold on. You can't just say that the argument's bad and then have it be bad. If there's pieces here that he's offering to support that argument that you're just outright rejecting to even acknowledge or look into or address.
And again, that's another kind of thing that streams down from academia, because when we critique things in academia, because we feel like we can't just say something is good ever, you go after the methodology. Because if you raise enough doubts about the methodology of whatever study or whatever logical framework that they conduct, then you can therefore question the evidence. Because your methods were bad, therefore your evidence is bad. And in many cases, that's often true. But academics have a really, really hard time taking those sorts of methodological challenges that are really common and widely understood in academia and making them digestible in a way that normal people can understand.
Mm-hmm.
Not because normal people are dumb, but because academics are too wrapped up in themselves to realize that these sort of jargony methodological challenges make absolutely zero sense to the average person. So when Murray says, your evidence is bad and, for this academic reason, he could very well be right, but he's explaining it in a way that doesn't make sense to people who are not in academia, because I think academia's conventions are the weird one in this sense, not what normal people really engage with.
But Gary, right there, that's where Dave's having success, though, right? Because he's not trying to convince the academics. He's trying to talk to your average person, right? So, this kind of goes back to, from the very beginning of our conversation today, is going back to the young folk, right?
Yep.
This is a group of folks who are growing up and they're not academics. And frankly, I think we're going to watch as more and more folks reject college outright because it's a big effing waste of money. I just saw this video of this poor girl who she's been spending $1,500 a month on paying off her student loans with a 17% interest rate, only now after 3 years to owe more money than she had been paying. And the fact that she owed more money than she actually spent on going to college in the first place, right? So more folks are leaving the college education system, and more folks are starting to leverage these online resources, which is going to turn into more people doing self-education and learning at their own pace and figuring out what they want to learn versus, to your point, the common what'd you use, the canon, right? Like they're going to get away from the canon. So there's going to come a point, and this goes back to a conversation we had with Abdullah Hayek, where we watched as more and more young Americans are becoming less in favor of the state of Israel. And we highlighted in that episode where, 68 or 63% of young GOP voters supported Israel in 2021. That number is down to 48% today, just 3 years later. That's a big drop. And it's going to continue going down, I believe, as not just, what we see from an education standpoint change, but then the current event standpoint is going to continue to happen. And that's going to lead more people to start to question things. So going back to what you were just saying there, this is where I think your academics, you have to actually address the arguments that are being raised, not just ignoring them, because the more you ignore, the more folks like Dave Smith are going to be able to go out and curate a larger audience. Now, in my perspective, I think that's a good thing because I want more and more people asking questions from the accepted narrative. I don't necessarily want us to all just buy into one accepted canon. I think that we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, kind of walk to the same beat of the same drum, but also question the conductor when the conductor's maybe having us off tempo or having the wrong instruments play at the wrong time, right? From a silly musical example. But like, this is where, I think folks like Dave Smith, and then, you can go in further, right? Like your Daryl Coopers, your Scott Hortons of the world, they have a lot of value because they're presenting things that traditionally were not talked about in the education system in America, but also things that they directly are having manifestations today in like actual current events and policy that come from 40, 50, 70 years of kind of, festering behind the scenes. It's like a volcano, right? Like the volcano doesn't just erupt. The volcano has that caldera down below where the magma builds up, the pressure increases, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, boom, it explodes. That's where we are today, is that, 70 years ago, the caldera was festering, right? More and more issues were happening, and now it's erupting, but the eruption's already happened. The lava's flowing down the side of the mountain, right? You can't just say, ignore that. That's silly mountain. That mountain's not supposed to have lava.
It depends on the type of volcano. If it's one of the Hawaii ones, you can sometimes ignore it.
That's fair. Or it's Mount St. Helens and it blows an entire side of the mountain off, but I digress. Gary, we are well past time today, and I apologize for keeping you so long. This is one of those conversations that and by the way, the reason we've gone on so long today and this back and forth is because this is the conversation that folks are having at their kitchen tables, right? Like this is the stuff that more and more young voters are starting to ask questions about. And, I back during COVID, I had one of my top selling bumper stickers. You know what it was? Question everything. Because accepted narratives were being proven in real time not to be true. Right. And this kind of goes back to like during COVID, dude, like, yeah, folks could have ignored my arguments for sure. But man, I was bringing epidemiologists on. I was bringing like, healthcare workers in the field on, and I was presenting real life data, evidence. And after a while, you can't just say your argument's bad when the data and evidence are actually backing it up. And oh, by the way, real life starts to back it up as well. And I'm just going to say, I think that's carrying over to where we are today. But that's my final thoughts for us. Gary, bring us home. What do you want the audience to take away from today?
Oh, it's just, this is something we need to think about. And regardless of where you stand on this sort of issue, you can't be complacent about it. And I don't think anyone would really disagree that media literacy in this country, especially in our education system, is really not good. So the one thing I would say to people is that when you're reading things, whether it's from the established narrative or from the subversive sort of anti-narrative, question their data sources. Where are they getting their information from? What could be some of the problems with that? Look at their arguments. Do they logically follow from the data? Do they, make sense with the data in mind? And also look at, you do have to look at the person making the argument, not just to immediately dismiss them, but perhaps they have biases or pre-existing relationships that could predispose them to overlooking something or making one argument over the other. There are ways to educate yourself in this type of thing in a healthy manner. You just don't have to rely on experts to decide things for you, because experts really did, to your point, shoot themselves in the foot during the COVID-19 pandemic. Total unnecessary own goal. And expertise is important, but it's not everything. Not everything.
It's like, I don't know if folks are big football fans like I am, but it reminds me of back like the 1970s, I think it was. There was a defensive lineman for the Minnesota Vikings, and he recovered a fumble. And now, mind you, defense, right? You're trying to stop the offense from going one way. He recovers a fumble, and he ends up going the way that the offense was going. And his team's like, no, turn around, Jim, turn around. And he runs into the end zone, scoring a touchdown, he thinks, for the defense, only he ended up scoring 2 points for the offense because it was technically a safety. Yeah, like that's exactly what happened during COVID. And by the way, where we are today, RFK is the head of HHS. So if that doesn't speak to how one thing that you can drop the ball or score in the wrong goal can lead to a complete opposite alternative reaction. I don't know, having RFK as head of HHS certainly plays that role. Gary Frankel, this has been a great conversation, dude. I really enjoy our chats. And by the way, folks, like this is one of the reasons that we do this show, because we definitely approach things very much through a cordial lens. This is a topic, like if you go watch this on Piers Morgan, God help you, you're going to hear people, you're anti-Semitic, you hate the Jewish people, you hate the Palestinians. Like, shut up. None of that. We don't do that here. We have conversations like, because, at the end of the day, we have to live in this floating rock through space together. That's just the reality. So if we can't have conversations cordially about topics that are heated and have, a lot behind the scenes, then, well, what are we going to do? Just, blow ourselves up? We'll see. Gary Frankel, this has been a great conversation. With that being said, where can folks go ahead, continue the conversation with you, social media links, all that and more?
I'm most active on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now at FrankelGarion.
Yeah, I didn't know your name was Garion.
Yeah, it's after the protagonist of a series of fantasy novels.
Is that canon?
I would like to think so. It's canon for me.
Good stuff. Gary Frankel, thanks for joining the show. And thank you, folks, for joining the show today. With that being said, Brian Nichols signing off here on the Brian Nichols Show for Gary Frankel. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.